The morning of the funeral felt like a film played too slow. Everything moved, but my heart didn't. The sky was gray in that quiet, indecisive way, as if even the heavens couldn't make up their mind about whether to cry. I remember tying my scarf with trembling hands, pausing before the mirror. My face looked older than I felt inside, more tired than grieving. I thought I'd be swallowed by sadness, but instead what I felt was something stranger. Not sorrow, not anger, not even numbness. It was disorientation, like my husband had vanished from the center of my world, and in his place, everything was being rearranged without my permission. We had been married 42 years. That's not just a life together. It's layers of memories built like wallpaper one over the next, and now I was expected to walk into a room filled with people and say goodbye, as if it were a simple event. My son had let his wife plan everything. That wasn't the problem. I didn't mind help. But it wasn't help. She had taken over. Every detail, every flower, every song her name was on the decisions. Mine wasn't even asked. At the church, I noticed immediately. She was directing people, gesturing at ushers, adjusting ribbons, snapping her fingers, as if this were a business event and not my husband's final ceremony. I tried to step into the sanctuary quietly, hoping maybe someone would notice me, the widow. But no. I was just another pair of sensible shoes guided not to the front pew, but 2 rows behind, while she sat squarely next to my son holding the baby, as if the child belonged to the moment more than I did. I couldn't even see the casket properly, just the outline, just the white flowers. I thought maybe someone would turn around and invite me forward. But all I received were polite glances, nods of acknowledgement, and one woman whispering, "That must be his mother. That must be." Not her name, not his wife, just a role, a shape, a figure at the edge of grief. I kept my hands folded and didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because the sadness had nowhere to land. It's hard to grieve when you feel you're interrupting someone else's performance. When the service ended, she stood up first. She guided the baby's hand to wave at the casket. She turned toward the guests and thanked them. My son looked exhausted but compliant. I rose more slowly, my knees stiff. No one waited for me. I walked out alone, the cold air meeting my face like a slap I didn't see coming. At the cemetery, it was worse. I wanted to place a rose on the coffin before it lowered, but she stepped in and handed the flower to our granddaughter instead. My hand hovered, unsure. I don't think she noticed. Or maybe she did. Maybe that was the point. The pastor said the last words, and as the casket was lowered, I watched her slip an envelope into the ground beside it. A family letter, she said to someone behind me. A private note, she called it. I wasn't given one, not even told it would happen. I just stood there, a gust of wind tugging at my sleeves, and realized that somehow, in the final chapter of my husband's story, I had been written out. People hugged me on the way back to the cars. Some gave me that patronizing smile, the kind you give to a woman you assume is too old to matter but too polite to ignore. She ushered them toward the reception, as if it were her home, and I followed the line like a shadow floating behind everyone, wondering what part of my life I had lost along with my husband. But I didn't speak up. Not yet. Not then. Because in that moment I still thought maybe it was just stress, just the weight of grief, just the chaos of loss. It wasn't. It was the beginning of something I hadn't yet dared to name, a quiet erasure. And like most things that break your heart, it started small, unnoticed, behind the scent of lilies and the echo of church bells. I remember the click of my heels on the pavement as we returned from the cemetery. Each step sounded too sharp, too alone. My son offered me his arm halfway to the car, and I took it not because I needed help walking, but because I needed to remember I still had someone. But even in that small gesture, she was there, watching, standing by the passenger door like a gatekeeper. She smiled at him and held out the baby, forcing a soft transition from grief to duty. And just like that, he let go of my arm. We arrived back at my home, the home my husband and I had lived in since the children were little. The house still smelled like his shaving cream, his coffee routine, the pipe he kept in the drawer even after he quit. But when we walked through the door, it didn't feel like mine anymore. She had taken over. The table was already set. Catered dishes had arrived in boxes I didn't recognize. There were white candles and too many linen napkins, not a single familiar dish, not even the plum cake I always made for gatherings. She was at the center of it all, pointing to trays, directing people where to put their coats, refilling wine glasses, as if this were her kitchen. I hovered by the archway between the hall and dining room, unsure whether to step forward or simply disappear. A neighbor tried to hug me, but she pulled him aside for a quick update. She didn't ask me if I was okay. No one did, really. I think they assumed the silence on my face was composure. It wasn't. It was confusion, displacement, as if I'd wandered into someone else's memory. I finally found a moment to sit down, not at the head of the table, but at the far end near the window. I wanted to be close to the light, maybe to breathe again. The chatter around me was light. Someone laughed too loudly at something trivial. She raised a toast to my husband, a speech I hadn't heard before, about his legacy of wisdom and devotion to family. I listened with tight fingers folded in my lap, wondering if she even knew the name of his favorite book, or how he used to hum under his breath when fixing the leaky sink. I got up quietly to refill the teapot and passed the kitchen where she stood, arms crossed, watching a young cousin struggle with the tray. She leaned over and muttered something I couldn't hear, but the way the girl's face flushed told me enough. I offered to help, but she shook her head. "No, it's okay," she said. "We've got it all under control." "We got it." I nodded, I smiled, and I returned to my seat like a guest in my own home. Later, I overheard a few guests asking her about the will, about how things were going to be handled. "We'll sort it soon," she said. "I just want to make sure things are streamlined." I caught my son's eye then just briefly. He looked away. That night, after everyone left, the house was too quiet. I picked up used napkins, straightened chairs, rinsed plates she said she'd take care of. My son had gone home with the baby. She didn't offer to stay. I stood in the living room, the air thick, with a dozen conversations I didn't belong to, and I finally let my shoulders fall. I had survived the day, but something inside me had shifted. It wasn't rage, no, that would have been easier. It was a dawning, a fog lifting. I was beginning to see the shape of my absence in the lives around me, a strange, slow realization that people had started to write plans around my silence, trusting that I wouldn't interrupt, that I'd keep folding napkins while they poured the wine. That night I slept in his chair, not because I wanted to cling to him, but because it faced the window. I needed to see the moon. I needed to remember I was still real, that I still lived here, that I had a voice even if they chose not to hear it. The funeral was over, but the unraveling had only just begun. The next morning was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but unsettles. I stood at the kitchen counter pouring my coffee, but I didn't drink it. The mug sat in my hand like an ornament from a life I no longer felt part of. I walked past the dining table, still half set from the day before, and looked toward the hallway. His coat was still on the rack, his slippers still by the door, and yet everything else felt as if it had shifted an inch to the left, familiar but not welcoming. That's when I noticed it, the tie, or rather the absence of it. My husband had a tie, navy blue with a silver thread that shimmered when the light hit just right. It wasn't expensive, not designer, not anything anyone else would notice. But he wore it on every meaningful occasion, our anniversaries, our son's graduation, that silly cruise where we danced like fools. He told me once, just once, that it was his lucky tie, said it made him feel like himself. And at the funeral, it hadn't been there. I hadn't realized in the moment too far back to see the details, too stunned to process, but the memory came back suddenly and sharply. The tie that had always been on him during every milestone wasn't on him for his final farewell. I opened our closet. I don't know what I expected to find, but I needed to look. And there it was, folded neatly, tucked behind his winter scarf like an afterthought, like something someone had deemed not suitable. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it in my lap. The fabric was soft, worn at the edges, still carrying the faint scent of cedar and something that was purely him. My fingers trembled. It wasn't the tie, not really. It was what its absence represented. The quiet decisions made without me. The stories rewritten. The woman who inserted herself into the most sacred details of my life and altered them one choice at a time. Had she thought it was ugly? Had she simply chosen another that photographed better? Or was it something deeper away to make the ceremony look the way she wanted, modern, curated, sanitized? I pressed the tie to my chest and sat there for what must have been an hour. I didn't cry. I hadn't yet. The tears wouldn't come because they had nowhere to go. No audience, no permission. They stayed tucked behind my ribs like ghosts who knew their place. Later that day, I tried to speak with my son. I called, gently asked about the funeral preparations, who had made the clothing decisions. His voice was distant, tired. She handled most of that, Mom. I wasn't thinking straight. We just wanted it to be nice. Nice. The word clanged in my ears like something hollow. He wanted to be buried in that blue tie, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause. Oh, I didn't know. That was it, not even surprise, just distance. And somewhere inside me, something began to pull back, like a tide retreating from the shore, no longer willing to meet the sand. I knew then that the grief I was experiencing wasn't just for my husband. It was for the life I'd shared with him, the partnership, the decisions, the knowing glances across a crowded room. All of it had been swept away in one weekend by a woman who'd never asked me what he loved, who he really was, what small things meant the most. And my son, my sweet boy, once so tender, had let her. That night I took the tie and placed it in his drawer, the one he'd kept locked for years, the one I'd never touched, not even when cleaning. I unlocked it with the small brass key that still hung on the back of his mirror. I placed the tie inside, as if laying a treasure to rest. And that's when I saw it. A letter folded carefully, sealed, in an envelope, with my name. My breath caught. My hand shook. It had my name in his handwriting, the same slanted loop he used on birthday cards. I didn't open it. Not yet. I pressed it to my lips, held it against my heart, and felt for the first time in days that he was still speaking to me. I would open it when the time was right. But for now, I sat quietly in the dim glow of our old reading lamp, surrounded by the echoes of a life we'd built. The blue tie rested where it belonged, and somewhere in the stillness, I realized this wasn't about grief anymore. It was about being erased. That night, I left the bedroom lamp on. I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping the light would spill into the corners he used to fill. Maybe I just couldn't bear the way the dark made everything feel final. I lay there listening to the creaks of the old house, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the same one he used to wind every Sunday. Time had become unfamiliar, slower, somehow yet not gentle. There was no one to whisper goodnight to, no hand to reach for, just the echo of my own breathing and the weight of things unsaid. The next morning I moved through the house like a ghost. I washed dishes no one had used, fluffed cushions no one would sit on. It was the quiet that felt most violent. Not a peaceful quiet, but a silencing, a smothering, as if even the walls had agreed to forget me. The doorbell rang around noon. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there she was, my daughter-in-law standing there with a clipboard and a plastic smile. I figured we should go over a few practical matters while things are still fresh, she said, stepping in without waiting for me to invite her. She moved past me into the living room as if it were her office. She sat down and opened the clipboard. So we've been discussing how best to divide things fairly, and of course we want you taken care of, but there's a lot to sort. You know how it is. No, I didn't. I'd never once thought of sorting my life into pieces like a file cabinet. I sat down slowly. She didn't look up from the papers. I think it's best if we sell this house in a few months. It's a lot for you to manage, and the market's strong. We could put the money into a joint trust, something safe, shared. I didn't respond. She continued. Also the antique cabinet. We think it would be safer at our place. With the baby crawling soon, it's better to keep delicate items out of reach. Our cabinet, the one we bought at a yard sale the summer after his heart scare, the one we refinished together. He called it our new old thing. Now it was just delicate items. Still, I said nothing, because if I spoke I might cry, and I didn't want to give her that. I didn't want her to mistake my sorrow for surrender. She took my silence as agreement, checked a box, smiled again. Then came the final blow. Also, I've reached out to the lawyer to begin the distribution process. Obviously, the will names your son, and you'll get your portion. But we just want to ensure things are streamlined, that we don't waste resources. Resources. That's what my life had become. Things to be streamlined, sorted, shifted, like I was just an old suitcase someone was too polite to throw away. She leaned forward, then her tone softening performatively. We know this is hard. We really want to support you, but we also need space to build our future. You understand, right? And finally, I looked at her. Really looked. Her makeup was perfect, her tone sweet, her words calculated. She wasn't being cruel. She was being efficient. And that was worse. Cruelty at least comes with emotion. Efficiency is cold. It erases without apology. I nodded, and she left. Clipboard tucked under her arm like a victory flag. When the door closed behind her, I stood for a long time. I walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, and ran my fingers along the edge of the teacup he bought me the year our daughter died. No one had asked me about that cup, or the story behind it, or what it meant. It was just another thing in a house now deemed too much for me. I sat at the table and finally opened his letter. His handwriting was smaller than I remembered. He had written it 3 years ago after his first hospital scare. If you're reading this, it means I've gone, and if you're alone, then I want to say what I should have said more often. You held us together. You built this home. You loved me when I wasn't easy to love. This place, this life, it only mattered because of you. If anyone tries to make you small, I hope you remember who you are. Don't let them silence you, not even the ones we raised. I sat with that letter in my lap for what felt like hours. He saw it. He saw me. And she never would. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not in rage, but in resolve. I would not spend the rest of my days being sorted. I would not fade politely into the background of my own story. Not anymore. The house felt heavier that evening, though nothing had changed physically. The furniture sat where it always had. The photos still lined the hallway, our wedding. The children when they were small, a camping trip in the 80s where my husband wore a ridiculous hat he'd refused to throw away, but the air was different now. I had opened something, not just his letter, but a part of myself I'd kept too quiet for too long. I sat at the kitchen table, his words echoing again and again in my chest. Don't let them silence you. Silence, I realized, isn't just the absence of noise. It's what fills the space when someone else speaks over you, when they make decisions without you narrate your life as though you've already left it behind. That night, as I walked down the hallway to his study, I paused in front of the door. I hadn't gone in since he passed. We always respected that space. It had been his sanctuary, just as the garden was mine. But now I needed to be near him again, to sit where he sat, to remember who I had been, when we were still we. I turned the knob slowly and stepped inside. Everything was just as he'd left it. Pens in their holder, a half-read book resting open on the desk, an old photo of us from 1974 in a makeshift frame he'd carved himself. I sank into his chair. The leather creaked, worn in the same spots his arms used to rest. I ran my hand over the wood grain of the desk, my fingers finding the worn groove where he'd always tapped when he was thinking. In the lower drawer, neatly stacked, were files, not just bank statements and receipts, but printouts of correspondence letters, even emails he'd printed out, because you never know when the cloud might vanish, he used to say. And among them, tucked between folders labeled with our children's names, I found the paperwork for the inheritance. He had already done it. He had outlined everything, made notes in the margins, thoughtful, intentional. My name was there. Of course it was. But what struck me wasn't the paperwork. It was the little post-it he'd stuck to the final page. If this gets messy, let her decide. Let me decide. Not the lawyer, not my son, certainly not her. Me. It was the first time in days that I felt upright, solid, not invisible. I leaned back in the chair and let the quiet settle around me, but it no longer felt like a smothering hush. It was calm, like a storm had passed inside my chest, and now the waters were still, but only for a moment. The next morning I made tea. The sun streamed through the curtains in the way it used to when he'd read the paper at the table. I took out my own pad of paper and began to write. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a rant. It was a letter, one I knew I would never send. Not because I didn't want her to read it, but because I didn't want her to matter that much. Still, I needed to say it, if only to myself. You walked into my home and treated it like a project. You planned my husband's funeral as if I were a distant relative. You called my history clutter. You called my grief inconvenient. But I was here before you. I scrubbed these floors with my own hands, taught my son how to tie his shoes in that hallway, and held my husband through 4 decades of love, anger, silence, and forgiveness. I am not fragile. I am not done. And I will not hand over the story of my life like a bag of old clothes you think no one wants anymore. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the fireplace. I didn't want to keep it. I didn't need to. I only needed to write it. The flames took it slowly, curling the edges, blackening the words. I watched it disappear, not with sadness, but with certainty. Afterward, I walked into the living room and looked around. Not with nostalgia, with new eyes. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a line in the sand. And I was ready not to fight, not to argue, but to stand, quietly, firmly, in the life I had built, in the dignity I still owned. They may have mistaken my silence for surrender, but they were about to learn what silence truly sounds like when it speaks for itself. It was the lawyer, my husband's, and now apparently theirs. He sounded polite, careful. That particular kind of voice people use when they're speaking to someone they've underestimated. "Just calling to go over a few logistics, Mrs." he began, but I stopped him gently. "I know what this is about," I said, my voice soft but steady. "You want to discuss the inheritance." He cleared his throat. Yes. We're just tying up a few ends. I understand there was some uncertainty surrounding the property, and your daughter-in-law mentioned you'd be stepping back from managing things directly." Stepping back. The words were like thorns, small, sharp, thrown with a smile. "I see," I replied. "Well, I've reviewed the documents. My husband left it to my discretion. You'll see his note at the bottom of the final page." He was quiet for a second. I imagined him shuffling papers, finding the handwritten scrawl, that little yellow post-it that now felt like a golden shield. "Ah, yes, I do see that." I waited. "Well, then," he continued, "perhaps we can set a meeting. Go over your intentions. It's quite a sizable sum, and I'm sure the family would benefit from clarity moving forward." "Of course," I said, "clarity is important." We set the appointment for Friday, and when I hung up the phone, I just sat there staring out the window at the garden. The daffodils were pushing through the soil again. A bit early, perhaps, but stubborn as ever. He used to say they were brave sprouting even when the frost still lingered. I like to think he admired that about them. I like to think maybe he admired that in me, too. Friday came quietly. I wore my gray coat, the one he always said made me look like a woman who knew her mind. I packed a cloth-bound folder with the notes I'd written and walked to the office like someone walking to church, not with fear but reverence, for what I was about to say, for what I had come to claim, not money, not land, but my right to speak. The office was too modern, too clean. A glass door, chrome handles walls that didn't remember anything. The lawyer greeted me with that same smile professional rehearsed. I sat down across from him, knees, steady fingers folded. So he said, leaning forward, "Have you decided how you'd like to proceed with the estate?" I nodded. "I have." I handed him the folder. He opened it, read, then read again. I watched as his expression shifted not drastically but enough. A pause in the rhythm of his breath, a hesitation in the movement of his pen. "I see," he said slowly. "You're donating the full amount." "To the shelter," I said. "The Women's Center on Maple Street. The one that never turned me away when I was 23 and afraid to go home." He looked up. I met his eyes. "Is your family aware?" "They'll find out soon enough," I said. "But this is my decision. My name is on the papers. My husband left it to me not to be divided or debated, but to be chosen." He hesitated, then nodded. "You understand this may create tension." I smiled. There already is tension. The only difference now is that I've decided not to make myself smaller just to keep the peace. He didn't argue. Just signed the line I asked him to. Filed the papers. It was done. I walked out into the late morning sun, my breath catching in the cold. The wind tugged at my coat, but I pulled it tighter around me. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just the quiet knowledge that I had done something bold without needing to shout. At home, the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for their voices, not the confusion, not the anger, not the questions. They could wait. I brewed tea, took the cup out to the garden, sat on the wooden bench he had made from old porch rails. The daffodils were taller now, stronger. And so was I. The inheritance had never really been about the money. It was about what I inherited through him, the right to remember, to protect, to choose. He trusted me to carry something forward, and I had. Not for them, but for me. Not out of spite, but because I needed the silence. Real silence, not the kind they forced on me by speaking over my life, but the kind I chose, the kind that filled a room with space for thought, for memory, for breath. I walked through the house like I was reacquainting myself with it, touched the edges of door frames, opened windows I hadn't opened in years, dusted shelves I used to dust with music playing, and him humming in the background. The house felt mine again, not because they had left, but because I had reclaimed it in my mind. The third day I listened to the voicemails. There were 5 from my son, 3 from her, 1 from an unknown number I recognized anyway, his cousin always too eager to mediate. My son's first message was calm, curious. By the second, his voice held a fragile edge. By the 5th, it had hardened into something clipped and rehearsed. "Mom, I don't understand what's going on. You didn't mention anything about this decision at the reading. We thought you'd talk to us first. I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed." Disappointed. That word. That old weapon children wield when they forget how many times you've swallowed your own disappointment just to give them joy. Her message was colder. "I wish you'd spoken to us. This affects the family. It affects the baby's future. It just feels like a punishment, and I don't understand what we did to deserve that." That was the thing, wasn't it? She didn't understand. They thought it was about money, about revenge, but it wasn't. It was about being erased in real-time, day by day, until one day I looked around and saw a life that had been drafted without me, like a new edition of a family story, where my name had been footnoted, not centered. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I went up to the attic. I hadn't been there in years. The air was thick with dust and the past. Boxes lined the walls, holiday decorations, old blankets, school projects my children had long forgotten. I found the one labeled letters. Inside were bundles of envelopes tied in string. His words, my words, paper soaked in our story. I sat cross-legged on the wooden floor and read them for hours. One letter caught me. Written in 1982, on a night when we'd had a fight so sharp it left us silent for 3 days. He had slipped it under my pillow. "I know you think I don't see you, but I do. I see the way you keep everything running even when your heart is tired. I see how much you carry and how little you complain. I don't say it enough, but I admire you. I love you not just for what you are to me, but for who you are when no one is watching." I closed my eyes and let the ache wash over me. He had seen me, and maybe that was enough. I came downstairs just as the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the lace curtains. The phone rang again. This time, I picked it up. My son's voice was uncertain. "Mom?" "Yes. I just want to understand why." I didn't sigh. I didn't scold. I spoke softly, like I was telling a bedtime story to someone who had forgotten what comfort sounded like. "I was never asked, darling, about the tie, the service, the house, about how I was doing. Decisions were made like I was already gone. You stood beside her while I was moved aside. You didn't mean to hurt me, I know that. But you didn't protect me either. And now I'm protecting myself." He was quiet. I didn't realize he whispered. "I know." Another pause. "Is it final? The donation?" "Yes, it's already done." I could almost hear the shift in him. Not anger, not yet acceptance, but the first tremor of understanding, the crack in the surface. "I just wish we'd talked sooner," he said. "So do I." We said goodbye without solving everything. Some things don't need solving. They need to be acknowledged. I hung up and the house felt still, but not lonely. I had spoken. I had been heard, even if just for a moment. And that was more than I'd had in years. There's a kind of peace that follows a storm, not the jubilant kind, but the heavy knowing kind. The kind that makes you sit still with your hands in your lap and realize just how much you've survived. I felt that peace a few days later as I stood by the window with my tea watching rain gently tap against the glass. The world outside looked washed and soft, like the earth itself was exhaling. They hadn't called again. Not since the last conversation with my son. Not since I told them it was done. There was no explosion, no screaming matches or doorstep confrontations. Just quiet. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. I started to hear my own thoughts again. The kind that had been drowned out for years by family obligations, other people's schedules, the slow erosion of being needed less and less. It was strange to move through a house that was mine in name, but had for so long been shared. Every drawer held a trace of someone else's hand. Grandchildren's socks labeled spice jars from her attempt at organizing my pantry, even the high chair she insisted belonged in the dining room, just in case. I began gathering those things, gently, respectfully, packing them into boxes, not with bitterness but with clarity. I wasn't making space for someone else. I was reclaiming space for me. I found my embroidery kit buried behind plastic tubs of old toys. I pulled out unfinished cloth threads that had dulled with time, a pattern I'd meant to complete years ago. I set it on the kitchen table and began again. My hands were slower, less certain than they'd once been. But they remembered. Each stitch felt like a small act of remembering, not of them, not of the children, or the chaos, or the roles I'd played, but of me, the girl who used to stitch flowers into napkins, because she believed beauty should be in everything, even the ordinary. A week after the donation paperwork had been finalized, I received a letter in the mail. Not a bill, not a legal notice, a proper handwritten letter from the director of the shelter. She thanked me, not just for the donation, but for the story I'd shared when I signed the documents in person. She said my words had lingered with her. This money should go to women who've been made to feel small. I won't be part of shrinking another woman ever again. She wrote that they would use the funds to build a new wing one with its own garden, a quiet place for healing. I cried when I read it, not because I regretted anything, but because for the first time, I felt like something I chose would outlive the silence. That night I lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. I imagined him sitting beside me in his old chair asking if I'd used the good tea leaves, or the cheap ones. I smiled. I whispered, "It's the good stuff." And then I told him everything, not aloud, not in words, but in the way you speak to someone who knows your soul. I told him how I found the tie, how she'd seated me at the back, how I opened the drawer and found the letter, how I'd almost disappeared, but didn't. I felt the warmth of the candle flicker against my palm. It was enough. In the morning I went out to the garden. The daffodils had opened, their petals wide, defiant in their brightness. I knelt beside them, touched one gently, and whispered, "I'm still here." I didn't need a spotlight. I didn't need applause. All I needed was a patch of earth that remembered I had once planted something and that it had bloomed. There are many ways to make noise, and sometimes the loudest sound in the world is a woman choosing herself. The phone stayed quiet after that. Days passed without a word from them. No knocks at the door, no messages disguised as concern, just the steady rhythm of my own life, returning to me in pieces I hadn't realized were missing. I began waking up earlier, not because I had errands or duties, but because the morning had become mine again. The light slanted differently through the curtains at dawn, soft and golden, almost apologetic. It was the kind of light that asked nothing of me. One morning, I pulled out the old photo albums, the ones from before everything got complicated, before titles like in-law and burden and inheritance had begun to shadow our family. I flipped through page after page of real smiles, crooked pigtails, fingers sticky with jam arms, wrapped tightly around legs in family piles on the carpet. There he was in every chapter. In the background, sometimes always holding something, a child, a camera, a plate of food. He had been the gravity in our house. And without him, I'd begun to float. Not aimlessly, but unmoored. In one of the albums, I found a photo I hadn't seen in years. We were young, very young, at a park. He was lifting me in the air, and I was laughing so hard my eyes were closed. No makeup, no plan, no future mapped out yet, just joy. I traced my face in the photo with the tip of my finger and whispered, "There you are." Later that week, I ran into an old friend at the market. We hadn't spoken since before the funeral. She reached for my hand without saying anything at first, then gave it a squeeze and looked at me carefully, like someone checking if a wound was still bleeding. "I heard what you did," she said softly. I nodded. "Brave," she added. "Hard, but brave." "I didn't do it to be brave," I replied. "I did it because I remembered who I was." She smiled, then the kind of smile only another woman of a certain age can give. One that says, "I know. I understand. I've been erased too." We stood there in the aisle for longer than people normally do, and it was enough. Sometimes solidarity doesn't look like banners or loud support. Sometimes it looks like two women standing beside the onions, refusing to rush the moment. Back at home, I found myself rearranging the sitting room. Not for guests, for me. I moved the chair by the window, brought in a small table from the guest room, and placed my embroidery kit there. A space just for stitching and watching the light, just for being. I framed the photo from the park and set it on the mantel. That evening there was a knock at the door. I froze for a moment. Something in me stirred, not fear, not even annoyance, just readiness. I opened it and found my son. He looked tired, more than tired, hollowed out in that way grief leaves you when you've been ignoring it. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside without speaking. He sat on the couch, not reaching for the remote or his phone, just looking around like he didn't recognize the place anymore. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I didn't either. Not fully. "I talked to her," he said. "She's angry." "I know. She thinks you did it to punish us." I sat across from him. I didn't. "I know," he said, and I believed him. Something in his voice had softened, like the boy I raised had returned, if only for a moment. "I should have defended you more. At the funeral. With the house. I let her take over because I didn't know how to hold everything. The grief, the details, the family." He looked down. "But I see now that I let you vanish. And I'm sorry." There it was. Not perfection, but recognition. I nodded. "You didn't make me invisible, but you didn't stop it either." "I know," he said again, and then I miss him. So do I. We sat in silence for a while, a real silence, one that held space for both of us. Not a silence filled with assumptions or bruised egos, just breath, just time. When he left, he hugged me, tightly, like a son should. He didn't ask me to undo anything. He didn't bring up the money. He just said, "I'll call more," not about anything important, just to call. And as I closed the door behind him, I realized something. I hadn't just donated the inheritance. I had inherited myself. It was a few days after my son's visit that I noticed something small but deeply meaningful. The mail came, and for the first time in months there wasn't a single envelope addressed to occupant. They'd always come ads for services. I didn't need reminders from institutions that no longer cared if I was a name or a number. But that day the letters were real. One from the local gardening club, another from the shelter, and one from an old friend who'd moved south years ago and had heard somehow through someone about what I'd done. The letter was short. She simply wrote, "I hope it brought you peace. I hope it made you feel visible again. I think about you often." It made me cry, not from sadness, but from the sheer aching relief of being seen. That afternoon, I took out the old gardening gloves from the shed. The fingers were stiff from disuse, but the fabric still smelled like earth and sunshine and sweat. I hadn't touched the garden properly since before the funeral. Everything had been left to wilt, to rot where it fell. But now I walked barefoot into the soil and pressed my hands into the dirt. There's something sacred about reclaiming what has been neglected, not just the weeds, but the parts of yourself you were told were no longer useful. I pulled up the dead roots first, the ones that hadn't survived the frost. Then I cut back the overgrowth. Each snip of the shears felt like a sentence in a letter I was finally writing to myself. I am still growing. I am still here. Hours passed. The sun dipped low. My knees ached and my back protested. But I smiled anyway, because this pain was different. This pain was mine, earned, rooted in effort, not erasure. When I came inside, my hands stained with soil and sweat, I passed the photo on the mantel, the one from the park. I touched it lightly and whispered, "You'd laugh if you saw me today." That night I dreamed of him. It wasn't a grand dream, no long speeches or glowing light. He was just sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea from his favorite mug, reading the paper. When I walked in, he looked up, smiled, and said, "You've been busy." I smiled back. You wouldn't believe how much. I woke up feeling rested in a way I hadn't since before the funeral, as if something had returned to its proper place inside me. Later that week, I received an invitation from the shelter. They were holding a dedication for the new wing, the one my donation had funded. They called it the Hope Garden. I stared at the card for a long time. It felt surreal seeing my name printed beneath the words, in honor of her quiet courage. I wasn't used to being honored. I was used to being thanked sometimes, dismissed often, overlooked always. But honored, that was new. I RSVP'd with a simple yes. The event was small, local, filled with women whose faces told stories, without needing to speak. A woman with gray at her temples stood beside a younger one, with a nervous smile. A toddler clung to her leg. Another woman wore sunglasses. Though the day was cloudy, I recognized the sign of someone still hiding, still healing. When they introduced me, I didn't make a speech. I just stood, nodded, and said, "I wanted you to have a place that no one could take from you. We all deserve that." And they clapped. Not politely, not the way people clap out of obligation, but warmly, as if they understood that this donation wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming a voice and giving it back to others who had been told again and again to quiet down. Afterward, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said, "You made me feel less alone." I touched her shoulder. "You're not alone. Not anymore." As I left, I turned to take one last look at the garden beds. They were preparing, not yet planted, just dirt and promise. The same way I had been weeks ago, unplanted, waiting. Now I was blooming again, and this time I wouldn't be pruned into silence. The house, once so heavy with memory, began to breathe again. Not all at once, not with sudden joy or bright transformation, but slowly, softly, like a room filling with morning light. I began noticing the quiet comforts, the familiar creak of the floorboard near the hallway, the subtle fragrance of the lavender sachet in the linen drawer, the way the kitchen faucet still dripped, no matter how many times he tried to fix it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. And after a life of bending and shrinking and trying to keep everyone else comfortable, steadiness was the most radical thing I'd known. It was a Wednesday when she showed up. No warning, just her small white car in the driveway, engine still humming. I was pruning the rose bushes, the ones he planted the year we almost separated, the year we chose each other again instead. I stood slowly, wiped my hands on my apron, and waited. She stepped out like she was walking into a problem she'd already decided how to solve. Her heels clicked on the walkway. Her blouse was too crisp, her smile too sharp. "I thought we could talk," she said, standing a bit too straight. "I didn't want things to be like this." I said nothing, just nodded toward the porch. She followed me up the steps and sat down across from me in the old wicker chair that still leaned slightly to the left. I offered no tea, no small talk. She folded her hands, glanced around. "It's quiet here." "Yes," I replied. "It is." She looked at me, then not through me for once, but at me, and for a second she looked like a woman unsure of herself, a crack in the armor. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You came. That's saying something." She blinked, taken aback. "I thought you'd be angrier." I looked out at the garden. I was never angry. I was erased. "There's a difference." She shifted uncomfortably. "I thought I was helping. I thought after he passed we should take over the hard parts, give you time." I turned toward her gently. "But you didn't ask what I needed. You assumed what I lacked." She lowered her eyes. "I see that now." We sat in silence for a while, real silence. Not polite, not tense, just stillness. Finally, she said, "I didn't expect you to give it all away." "I know." "We had plans." "I had plans too," I said, "but no one asked me to share them." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she looked out over the yard toward the daffodils, nodding in the breeze. "I suppose you hate me," she murmured. "I don't," I said simply. "I pity how little you see in people who aren't in control." Her face tightened, then relaxed. A breath passed between us. She stood. "I should go." I nodded. She walked to the steps, paused, turned. "You gave away a lot. I kept what mattered." She left after that quietly, without another word. I sat on the porch long after she drove off, the wind playing with the edge of my scarf. I felt no regret, no victory, just the warmth of having finally said what needed to be said. That night I lit a candle again, this time not for him but for me, for the woman I had once been, the woman I had become, and the one I was still unfolding into. I wrote in my journal for the first time in years, not just lists or reminders, but real thoughts. I wrote about the ache of being dismissed, about the strength it took to speak quietly and still be heard, about how sometimes you have to lose your place in someone else's story to finally find your own. The pen moved like it had been waiting. And when I finished, I wrote just one last line at the bottom of the page. I did not disappear. I was simply waiting to return. The days after her visit unfolded like silk, smooth, slow, and deliberate. I didn't rush through them. I didn't fill them with errands or favors or family obligations. For the first time in my life, I let the days carry me. I took walks in the early morning before the street grew loud with motion. I sat on the bench beneath the old maple tree and watched squirrels bury their little secrets beneath the dirt. I learned the pattern of the birdsong again. In the afternoons, I began baking. Not because someone needed cookies or because a bake sale demanded it, but because I missed the feeling of flour on my hands, the weight of an old wooden spoon in my grip, the hush that fills a kitchen as something rises in the oven. I found his old recipe card for apple cake, the one with the faded corner where he'd once spilled coffee and apologized like he'd burned a sacred text. I made it exactly as he did, bruised apples and all. When I took the first bite, I could almost hear him in the next room, calling out that it was a little dry this time, just to tease me. And I laughed, really laughed, alone in my quiet kitchen. I had started a new kind of grieving, not the kind that begs for what was, but the kind that honors it while making room for what's next. One afternoon, the phone rang again. This time it was my granddaughter. She's only 6, so her voice is all breath and curiosity. "Grandma," she said, "Mommy said you did something unexpected." "What's unexpected?" I smiled. It's when someone thinks they know what you'll do, and then you surprise them. There was a pause. Then she asked, "Did you surprise Mommy?" "Yes," I said, "and maybe myself too." She giggled like that answer made sense. Then in that innocent, oblivious way only a child can manage, she said, "I made you something. It's pink and purple and has 3 hearts. Daddy says we can visit soon." "I'd like that," I said, "very much." After we hung up, I sat on the couch and just breathed. It's a strange kind of freedom to no longer be expected to fix or give or soften every edge for everyone else. It's strange and wonderful. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't waiting for apologies. I had no revenge left in me, just a calm that came from understanding where I stood, and more importantly, where I chose to stand. That evening I went through one last box. Tucked at the bottom was the donation receipt, a thin slip of paper, plain and unimposing. But what it represented was anything but. As I held it, I remembered something my husband used to say when we paid bills together. He'd look at a receipt and smile, saying, "We traded money for peace. That's not a loss. That's a bargain." And this was the best bargain of all. I had traded money for dignity, control for clarity. I had given away what they assumed was my only leverage, and instead, I had claimed something far greater myself. Not the mother version, not the caretaker, not the widow. Just me. I folded the receipt and placed it in the back of my journal, behind the letter I'd never sent, and the photo I'd copied from the mantel. Let the others carry their shock, their confusion, their sense of injustice. I would carry this, a name that still mattered, a story that still held weight, a life that had not been wasted just because someone else forgot to say thank you. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees like applause, soft and scattered. I stepped onto the porch with my tea and whispered into the night. It was never about what they took. It was always about what I remembered to keep. It rained the next morning, a soft, steady kind of rain that blanketed everything in silver light. I sat by the window, wrapped in my shawl hands, curled around a warm mug, and listened to the soft tap-tap against the glass. The world looked blurred, softened, as if the rain had smoothed out all its edges. It felt fitting. I'd smoothed mine, too. I wasn't the same woman who'd stood in the back row at her husband's funeral, swallowing her presence like a bitter pill. That woman still lived inside me, yes. But now she had a voice, a spine, a garden full of daffodils to tend to. And yet with peace comes reflection, and reflection is never without ache. I thought of my son more often now, the guilt in his voice, the quiet in his eyes. He hadn't called again, not since that first apology, but he had sent a photo. It came in a text message, a rare thing from him. A picture of my granddaughter sitting in a field with wildflowers tangled in her hair, holding up a heart-shaped drawing, with my name scribbled across the top in uneven letters. Beneath it he'd written, "She misses you." We both do. I didn't reply immediately. I looked at that message for days, read it while the tea steeped, while the soup simmered, while the clothes hung drying by the window. I didn't know how to respond, not because I didn't care, but because I cared so much that I needed to answer with something true. When I finally did, I sent back a photo of the apple cake sliced neatly on a plate. She can help me bake next time. Tell her to bring the purple apron. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a reopening of doors long closed. But it was an offering, a thread tossed gently across the space between us, saying, "You can come back if you come gently, if you come differently." That small exchange was followed by more. A call this time from him on a quiet Sunday evening. His voice was softer. No pretense. No clipboard. Just a man sitting in his car, trying to find the words to rebuild a bridge. We didn't talk about the money, or her, or the decisions made in shadows. We talked about childhood, about how he used to hide under the dining table during storms, convinced the thunder was angry at him, about how I used to make up bedtime stories on the spot, voices and all, and how he always pretended to be asleep just so I'd finish them. I listened. He remembered. We shared something real. And when the conversation ended, he said something I hadn't expected. "Thank you for not yelling, for doing what you did quietly." I think I needed the silence to finally hear myself. I didn't say much in return. Just, "I'm still here." That matters. After that, time moved differently. Not faster, but deeper. I hosted the garden club at my house again, the same group of women I'd known for decades, each of us older now, each with our own quiet rebellions, tucked behind polite smiles and floral skirts. We sipped lemonade on the porch and laughed at things only women of our age would find funny. We shared more than gardening tips. We shared truths. One of them said, "You're glowing." And I was. Not in a way you could see in photographs, but in the way that happens when a woman reclaims her time, her name, her place in the world. I began writing too, not just journaling, real writing, essays, memories, thoughts that had lived too long in the back of my throat. I didn't care if anyone read them. That wasn't the point. The point was that the story no longer lived only in the silence. One afternoon I returned to the cemetery. Not for ceremony, not for guilt, just to sit. The grass was overgrown, the sky pale, the wind a whisper. I brought the letter he wrote me, the one I had found in the drawer. I read it again aloud this time. My voice was steadier than I expected. "I did what you asked," I whispered. "I chose, and I didn't let them make me small." I sat with that truth. I let it sink into the soil, and when I rose, I felt taller than I had in years. Autumn crept in quietly. One day the garden was still full of green, and the next golden leaves blanketed the yard like someone had gently tucked the earth in for a long rest. I welcomed the change. I always had. The turning of the seasons had been my calendar long before apps and planners. Autumn was for warm socks, cinnamon in everything, and the creaking sound of old wood beneath your feet as you moved slower, softer. I hung a small wind chime by the back porch. He would have teased me for it, said it would scare off the birds, but I liked the sound. It was delicate, almost like laughter in the breeze. Every time it chimed, I imagined his voice drifting through the trees, amused and affectionate, as though time hadn't taken him at all. I received another letter from the shelter. This one was handwritten by a resident, a woman in her 40s who had just left an abusive marriage. She said my story had been shared during a group session. They didn't use my name, but they talked about the woman who gave everything away because she'd had enough of being forgotten. She wrote, "You reminded me that leaving doesn't mean failing. It can mean choosing. You reminded me that silence can be sacred, that dignity doesn't require shouting. Thank you for giving us something we didn't think we were allowed to want space. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the back of my journal. That book had become something more than just paper now. It was my witness, my archive, my proof. That weekend I hosted my granddaughter. Just her. No parents, no explanations. Just a girl and her grandmother. She brought her little pink suitcase and the purple apron I'd mentioned. The moment she stepped inside, she said, "It smells like cake and hugs." I nearly melted right there. We baked together. She measured too much sugar and spilled the vanilla, and I didn't correct a thing. She laughed with her whole body, hands sticky flour in her hair. I let her make a mess of my kitchen, and I didn't feel the need to clean it up right away. Some messes are worth living in for a little while. That evening we sat on the porch, with our slices of apple cake wrapped in blankets, her small legs swinging mine, resting. She looked up and asked, "Why don't you live with us?" It wasn't an accusation, just a question curious and pure. "Because this is my home," I said. "And sometimes when you get older, you need your own quiet." She thought about that. "I think I'd like quiet when I'm old too, but I'd want someone to visit." "I'd like that too," I smiled. "I like visitors." She snuggled against me, then cake-forgotten eyes drifting closed. And in that moment, under the rustling leaves, with a child I'd once feared I would lose to someone else's version of legacy, I felt whole. Not fixed, not restored, but whole in a way that didn't require anyone else to understand. When she left the next morning, she kissed me on the cheek and said, "Next time, can we plant flowers instead of baking?" "Yes," I said, "we can plant whatever we want." After she left, I sat by the garden and looked at the space where the daffodils had lived. They'd faded now, as they always did, retreating underground until spring. But I wasn't sad. Some things bloom only once a year. Others, like dignity and truth, and the quiet conviction of choosing yourself, they stay rooted. Even through the winter, the first frost came early that year. I woke to a world dusted in silver, every leaf edged in ice, every blade of grass brittle and sparkling. I stepped outside in my thickest robe and let the cold kiss my face. There was a stillness to it, a kind of hush that only winter knows how to bring. No bird song, no wind, just breath meeting breath, turning to mist in the pale morning. I walked the perimeter of the garden boots, crunching softly over the frozen ground. Where the daffodils had been, there was nothing now but a bed of quiet. And yet I didn't feel empty. I knew they were there, deep beneath the soil, resting, waiting, preparing to return. So was I. Inside, the house had taken on a rhythm I'd begun to cherish. A cup of tea before sunrise. An hour of writing with the window cracked open just enough to let in the scent of cold. I stitched a new pattern into the old table runner, no longer following the guide, just letting my needle move where it pleased. Sometimes I still thought of her. Not with anger, not even with hurt. Just as you might think of a gust of wind that once slammed your door, startling loud, gone now. I knew we would never be close. I didn't need that. All I ever wanted was room, respect. And now that I had it, I found that forgiveness was easier to carry than resentment. One afternoon, the mail arrived with an envelope bearing no return address. Inside was a folded note and a single photograph. The note said, "I hope someday she grows up and learns to love like you do. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." It was her handwriting. The photo was of my granddaughter holding a bouquet of sunflowers in front of the new shelter garden. Her cheeks flushed, her smile wide and free. Behind her, a sign painted by hand. "Hope blooms here." I sat down slowly, the paper trembling in my fingers. This wasn't reconciliation. It was something quieter, a ripple instead of a wave. I placed the photo on the mantel beside the one of him lifting me in the park. 2 lives, 2 loves, side by side. Both hard-won. Both real. That evening, I stood at the mirror longer than usual. I studied my face, the fine lines, the silver strands woven through my hair, like threads of frost. I didn't see a woman faded. I saw one forged. I whispered aloud, not to him this time, but to myself. You stayed, through the silence, through the stillness, through the forgetting. And then I said it again. You stayed. The wind howled outside. Somewhere in the distance a branch cracked and fell, but I wasn't startled. I closed my eyes and let the sound pass. The next morning I began something new, a small memoir perhaps, not for publication, just for myself, for the woman I had been, for the girl who once felt too invisible to matter, for the future me who might one day forget how hard it was to find her voice. Each word felt like a stitch, a seed, a promise. I ended the first page with a line I'd whispered often lately, but never written until now. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. The ink bled just slightly into the page, but I didn't mind. I liked the imperfection of it, the honesty. Because that's what my life had become. Not a performance, not a script someone else handed me, but a story I was finally writing with my own hands, in my own voice, and I was nowhere near finished.